Hey, it's Sol with another video. Today we're going to take a deeper look at the new reward system that's going to govern just how players for Mythic Dungeons are going to get their gear. We're going to go over how things are now, get an idea of what the critics are looking for, and then do an overview and analysis of just how this new system is going to work in patch 8.1 Tides of Vengeance. Also keep in mind that I'm doing kind of a new format. I'm going to be jumping in and out. It's kind of like Budget Belluar. So it's going to be kind of like his format, just with darker hair and less charisma. So here we go. At the moment in the Battle for Azeroth, Azerite gear from dungeons is found in the following ways. Up to item level 340, or what I'm going to refer to as Raid Finder difficulty going forward, you can farm for drops simply by doing the dungeons that you want to do in Mythic difficulty. If you want to go any higher though, players only have one source of higher level gear, which is the Mythic Weekly Cache. Inside the cache is the entire pool of loot from dungeons, including Azerite gear. To help increase the chance of obtaining Azerite gear, Bad Luck Protection kicks in, increasing the chance of obtaining Azerite gear until it drops and then the system resets. Now there are obvious weaknesses to the system and unsurprisingly few, if any, strengths. This covers the absolute minimum requirement of including all the gear, but with only one source to obtain high-level Azerite pieces, and with that pool being greatly watered down by all the other non-Azerite gear, this makes for a potentially frustrating experience, to say the least. Consider that the career Mythic Dungeon player who does not do any raids, having such limited reach to Azerite gear, which is a primary feature of this expansion, I imagine that they feel pretty left out when they look at high-level raiding, where those players get to enjoy multiple chances for drops for multiple bosses, and tokens of false hope to boot. Haha. Not all Mythic Dungeon players raid, and not all raiders do Mythic Plus, and that's very, very important to respect. But in my opinion, I think Blizzard just overlooked Mythic Plus players, and they gave them a Legion kind of Mythic Plus system that just wasn't appropriately updated for the Battle for Azeroth, and this is largely because of Azerite gear. Now we have a system that's super vulnerable to this weakness, and a response from Blizzard that was admittedly very, very weak. They did at least acknowledge this problem, it's just that they didn't quite have a solution ready until this recent announcement, so let's go over what's going on. The Azerite gear from the dungeon pool is going to be put onto a vendor, and this is going to be distributed a number of ways. There will be random tokens like the Baleful or the Unsullied tokens from Legion for the head, the shoulder, and the chest slots that will give you a random piece from the dungeon pool, and there's going to be normal, heroic, and mythic versions of these items. Also, mythic versions of every piece of Azerite gear in Mythic Dungeons are going to be on the vendor as well, so you can work towards and buy these pieces a la carte. Buying from the vendor will require a new currency that is obtained in the following ways: scrapping or disenchanting epic quality Azerite armor, and from the weekly Mythic Plus chest. The amount that you obtain depends on the highest keystone that you complete, which from Lore's post is probably going to max out at Mythic level 10. It's not 100% certain, so don't take my word for it, but it's likely that the amount of currency that you receive from scrapping or disenchanting is also dependent on the item level of the Azerite gear that you scrap. Basically, Mythic Raid gear is probably going to give you more currency than a Warfront or LFR level gear. The one caveat though is that this vendor is now the only source of Azerite gear from the dungeon pool. Azerite gear will no longer drop from the weekly cache. As a first impression, I think this is a very welcome change for players who are just frustrated with the current system of randomness and the chaos, and they'd rather have a very transparent system and just have a goal to work towards. Looking at it broadly, it seems to be a very accessible system, however, it is something that seems to be catered mostly towards Mythic Plus dungeon people, which is totally fine because they are the people that were more than anybody left behind. There are some potential weaknesses though, and I'm going to get into that in just a little bit. So let's take another look at the Battle for Azeroth under this new paradigm, this vendor, and we'll see just how we'll be able to obtain as much of this new currency as possible. One obvious source is to complete a Mythic 10 or whatever the highest level dungeon is going to get you the most currency each week. From the sounds of it, this is going to be the single largest source of currency, and how this holds up against the other sources is going to be probably the biggest source of salt coming from the forums, and I'll have more on that in a bit. Next is to find, disenchant, and scrap epic quality Azerite gear, which comes from the following sources: the Daily Emissary, which happens to drop heroic level Azerite gear. There's raids, such as Raid Finder, Normal, Heroic, and Mythic. This also means Azerite gear drops from Uldir in all difficulties, older raids, under the presumption that this is also going to be included. This also means Warfronts as well as the Warfront Zone, which can drop a random piece of Azerite gear that's equivalent to LFR difficulty, and there's going to be 2 Warfronts in 8.1. Keep in mind that Warfronts are repeatable while they're active. There's also PvP, whether it's rated or it's the weekly reward that you get, weekly event caches like Time Walking, as well as the Mythic Dungeon event. The success or the frustration of this system, in my opinion, is going to come from 2 things. It's going to come from the value of scrapping this gear, as well as the cost of the most expensive pieces that you get from the new vendor, which is the a la carte mythic level pieces. This is where I'm going to get into the potential weaknesses of having a system that's based on currency, but let me point out that while Azerite gear is very powerful, or it's meant to be very powerful, it's still just 3 pieces of gear per spec. It's not an entire outfit of armor like trinkets and weapons and rings and all that. When rewards are predictable, like for example the previous Justice and Valor Point systems, there comes the expectation and even the pressure that players place on themselves, I want to emphasize that, to ensure that they maximize their currency gains, otherwise they run the risk of falling behind. The feel of competition, even with just yourself, is nothing new in a video game. Blizzard learned this lesson time and time again throughout World of Warcraft's history, and it's been reflected in this current iteration of the PvP gearing system, as imperfect as it may be. Currently in BFA PvP, there's a piece of gear that's presented to you that you can earn, and 1 new piece is introduced each week. You don't have to worry about falling behind though, because if you're on, let's say, week 10 of the PvP season, I can farm the crap out of Conquest and get all 10 pieces that might have been put up, and I'll be caught up with others who have been playing for all 10 of those weeks. On a side note, the actual process of getting this gear and the very high potential of getting a PvP downgrade relative to other sources, like if you happen to also raid and do, Mythic Plus and all that, that's kind of a side conversation, and I'm just going to summarize it in that getting downgrades from this current PvP system is very weird and it's very confusing, and I don't see that as a very great thing. However, for the purpose of today's conversation, we're just going to stay focused on the idea of not being left behind when having a sort of catch-up system. All right? Cool. Early PvE point systems didn't have this sort of catch-up, which meant that missing out on a few Justice or Valor points each week could not be made up for, and those points were just considered lost. This can be good or bad depending on the kind of player that you are, but this also meant that there was a maximum value for your time spent per character. As in, no matter how hard you could work, the pace that you obtain these kinds of rewards would always be in Blizzard's control. In other words, Valor and Justice points were just a transparent form of content gating. And the same is being evaluated here in Battle for Azeroth. There's just a lot more sources of currency to consider. So that's why I feel that it is incredibly important that there's a good relationship between the sources that you would get this currency from, the amount that you would get, the maximum amount that you would get from this mythic cache, and of course the final values of just how much these random tokens or these a la carte pieces are going to be. The way I've been seeing and stressing it, I see that this vendor is more for anybody, the Mythic Plus Dungeoneer runner person. So the amount of currency that's obtained from the Mythic cache should far outstrip whatever that you would get from disenchanting or scrapping gear, regardless of the source. In Lore's post, he stated the following goals for the new currency: that it should take 2 to 3 weeks for a player to purchase one of the random caches according to the level of dungeons that they play. So that should mean players that are completing 10s should be able to buy a random mythic piece every 2 to 3 weeks. But the question that we come back to is, how much are the other sources of currency going to be considered? Referring back to that post, completing a 10 is going to get you 3 times the currency as completing a 7, but keep in mind that this is just an example and not a promise. Because of the significant drop-off in the currency value that you get between a 10 and a 7, I'm going to speculate that scrapping Azerite gear is not going to be a significant source of currency, and one reason is that Blizzard still has to take into consideration the edge cases. Some players have considerably less self-control than others, and are more than willing to put out the time needed to farm old raids and war fronts, as that is a potential source of infinite Azerite gear, aka the vendor currency. It's likely that, whether or not Azerite gear is going to be infinitely farmable, Blizzard is calculating a specific range that players will be able to obtain the exact pieces of Azerite gear that they want through this vendor. So there are a few strategies with regards to getting this new Azerite currency, and this is just coming off the top of my head, but this is really based on your individual playstyle and tastes. One is that you can just play normally and bank these Azerite points until the time is right, and then use the currency to fill holes or meet milestones, like if you're really jonesing to get your character into that LFR. Two is to farm hard for each of the random mythic level caches that you get for, your head, your shoulders, and your chest. So that's anywhere between 6 to 9 weeks of farming 10s, as well as farming to whatever the heck other sources of Azerite gear you can get, so at the very least you have mythic slots filled. Now I'm aware that that's a very shotgun and reckless way of gearing and a huge potential waste of points, but at least as a tank, as a protection paladin, I feel less dependent on Azerite traits, at least currently. I might feel differently later on. But at the moment, I feel less reliant on those pieces, so at least for the moment, that's probably what I'm going to do. Another method still that some are very likely to follow is to farm extremely hard. Do 10s, do all the content that you have, and only very specifically buy the exact pieces that you want, knowing that chances are down the road there's probably going to be some tweaks to the Azerite system or some of the traits through hotfixes and other such things. So by the time you are ready to buy those pieces, you'll feel pretty comfortable with your purchase. A few thoughts come to mind, like what's going to happen between one tier and the next? Like, is there going to be some sort of Azerite point reset or something like that? And also, unlike the Justice or Valor point vendors, unless there's going to be new dungeons that are being introduced throughout this expansion, and I'm at least going to presume that there are, this gear isn't going to be updated, so at least visually we're farming for pretty much the same gear. Are players going to be okay with that? So as for my closing thoughts, I do like that there is this kind of hybrid or a marriage between this system of luck and this newer system of control that's going to be introduced in the patch. I mean, yeah, I might get a cool ring or a trinket somewhere down the line, but at least I know that there is a path to get that really killer piece of Azerite gear that I've always wanted. It's been my dream. From a broader perspective though, I do hope that Blizzard learns that today's WoW doesn't necessarily need to be all that different from yesterday's WoW. A system like what we're going to see with Azerite gear, I think it can be applied to systems like raids and PvP, but that's going to be a conversation for another day. So I want to thank you folks at home and those who are watching from your porcelain watchtower. Hey, thanks for watching and listening. I'd love to hear your thoughts in a comment below. Like, is this good? Is this method of gearing going to be fast enough for you? I have little doubt that something like this should have been done sooner or should have been communicated sooner, but what could make it even better? That's a wrap. So if you enjoyed the video and this kind of rip-off format, please hit that like button and subscribe so I can keep giving you more of this and all things Warcraft. I'll see you next time. Until then, stay safe, stay happy, and stay breezy.